I saw her on a TV show, and I had never seen her before, and I said, that's it. I said, whoever she is, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to take a chance.
What happens when one of Hollywood's most untouchable legends makes a final wish no one saw coming? Robert Redford was more than just an actor. He was a symbol of rebellion, of independence, of the kind of artistry that refuses to be boxed in. For decades, he dominated the silver screen, stepping into roles that defined entire eras. From the playful outlaw in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to the stern, Oscar-winning director of Ordinary People, his career was nothing short of extraordinary. But here's the twist. When his health began to decline, Redford didn't quietly retreat into the shadows of fame like so many others before him. Instead, he asked for something so raw and personal that it stunned even those who knew him best. His family, caught between heartbreak and duty, suddenly found themselves at the center of a mission that would shape how the world remembered him. And at the heart of it all was Amy Redford, his daughter, the quietest member of the family in the public eye, but the one who would soon carry the heaviest weight of all. Because this wasn't about money, awards, or press. This was about legacy, about how a man who had spent his life rewriting Hollywood would now decide how he wanted to be remembered when he's gone. Before we reveal what that final wish was, you have to understand the legend behind the name, because only then does the weight of his request truly sink in. Robert Redford wasn't born into Hollywood. He fought his way into it, a kid from Santa Monica who bounced through odd jobs, setbacks, and rejections before ever seeing his name on a marquee. When he finally did break through, it wasn't as a one-dimensional pretty face. It was as a performer who carried an almost magnetic defiance, a refusal to be ordinary. The world met this energy head-on in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid alongside Paul Newman. That film wasn't just a box office hit, it was the kind of cultural explosion that rewired what audiences expected from heroes. Suddenly, the outlaw wasn't just a villain or a joke, he was charismatic, flawed, human. Redford turned that archetype upside down, and Hollywood never looked back. But he didn't stop there. Movies like The Sting and All the President's Men cemented him not only as a leading man, but as a voice of the times. When he directed Ordinary People and it swept the Oscars, critics finally had to admit what fans already knew. Redford wasn't just another actor. He was a force, reshaping the very industry around him. And then came Sundance. Not the film, but the institute, the festival, the movement. While most stars built mansions and measured their careers in dollar signs, Redford invested in the future of storytelling. He opened doors for filmmakers who never would have had a chance otherwise. Scrappy voices, diverse perspectives, bold ideas. He wasn't content to sit back and enjoy his own success. He wanted to change the system. By the time he reached the later stages of his career, Robert Redford was untouchable. He had nothing left to prove. To Hollywood, he was a legend. To his fans, a hero. And to his family, he was still just dad. But even the brightest stars can't outrun time. And while Redford never stopped reinventing himself on screen, off-screen he was facing something he couldn't simply outact. Something far more human, far more devastating. Behind closed doors, Robert Redford was fighting a war most of the world didn't know about: Parkinson's disease. The illness had slowly, cruelly chipped away at the body of a man once defined by strength, charisma, and unshakable presence. To fans, Redford still appeared sharp, composed, and dignified in public. But at home, in the quiet of his Utah estate, the cracks were visible. His movements slowed. His once powerful hands trembled. His voice, which had once commanded entire theaters, now sometimes fell to a whisper. And yet, his spirit never dimmed. Those closest to him recall how he could still launch into stories about his early struggles, about Hollywood manipulation, about the friendships and rivalries that had shaped his life. Amy, his daughter, became the one who witnessed this most closely. She wasn't just a caretaker, she was the keeper of his memories. Every small conversation, every fragment of a story became precious. To her, it was heartbreaking to see the man who had once seemed larger than life now caught in the fragility of age. But at the same time, there was something unshakable in him. The wit was still there. The intensity still flashed in his eyes. He refused to let Parkinson's define him, even as it became impossible to ignore. It was in those quiet, fading days that the world seemed to hold its breath. Robert Redford, the man who had challenged studios, broken Hollywood molds, and fought for underdogs, was now engaged in a different kind of battle. One he couldn't win with charisma or talent alone. And just when it seemed his story was winding down, Robert did something no one expected. He revealed a final wish, not to fade away quietly, but to go out with one last act of defiance, a demand that would shake his family and especially Amy to the core. Because Robert Redford wasn't asking for peace, he was asking for fire. It happened in a moment so quiet, so ordinary, that no one in the room expected history to change. The family had gathered around Robert, their conversations hushed, the air heavy with the unspoken truth that his time was slipping away. He sat back in his favorite chair, frail but still carrying that unmistakable presence. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he made a request that stunned everyone. "Promise me," he said, turning to Sharon with a fire still flickering in his eyes. "Promise me they'll remember the fire, not the flicker." Those words landed like a lightning bolt. To some, they sounded like poetry. To others, like a challenge. But for Robert, they were something more. They were a declaration. He wasn't asking to be remembered as a man fading into illness. He wanted to be remembered for the passion, the strength, the rebellion that had fueled his entire life. He wasn't content with quiet goodbyes or fading gently into the night. He wanted one last moment, not as a patient in decline, but as Robert Redford, the legend, a man who had defined his career by doing what others said couldn't be done. And then came the shocker. He didn't just want people to remember the fire. He wanted to show it to them one last time, one final performance. A farewell not whispered in the shadows, but delivered with the same intensity that had once lit up the world. Amy Redford, sitting nearby, felt the full weight of her father's words. This wasn't just a casual wish. This was a demand from a man who had lived his entire life on his own terms. For her, the meaning was crystal clear. He wasn't asking to survive longer, he was asking to be remembered rightly. But how could that happen? His health was fragile, his body was failing. Doctors warned that any attempt to push him into the spotlight again could accelerate the inevitable. The risks were massive, the obstacles endless. And yet, Amy knew immediately she couldn't ignore it. She had to make it happen. Because when a legend like Robert Redford makes his final wish known, you don't question it, you fight for it. From the moment her father spoke those words, Amy's role shifted. She wasn't just his daughter anymore. She became the guardian of his legacy, the one person who would carry his final request forward no matter how impossible it seemed. The challenges were immediate. Doctors warned that the stress of performing could harm him. Friends and family expressed doubts, begging her not to risk his health for something symbolic. Even industry insiders who admired Robert were skeptical. Could a man in his condition truly pull off one last performance without it being heartbreaking to watch? But Amy had grown up in the shadow of her father's resilience. She had seen him rise after career setbacks, reinvent himself when critics counted him out, and fight personal battles no one knew about. She understood that his life had never been about playing it safe. It had always been about defiance, about doing what others believed was impossible. So she pressed forward. She began reaching out quietly to the people who had been closest to Robert throughout his career. Old collaborators, musicians, crew members, trusted friends who had been part of his journey from the beginning. One by one, they answered the call, understanding that this wasn't just another gig. This was history. Meanwhile, Amy navigated a storm of logistics, securing medical supervision, crafting a plan to minimize the risks, convincing skeptical family members that this wasn't about spectacle, but about dignity. And most of all, carrying the emotional burden of knowing that if this went wrong, she would forever bear the weight of having pushed her father too far. But Amy never wavered. Every sleepless night, every difficult conversation, every tear shed in private was fueled by one thought. This is what he wants. Her mission wasn't about making the world happy. It was about giving Robert the ending he deserved. In those weeks, the impossible slowly began to look possible. Plans took shape. The pieces started to align. And Amy realized something profound. This wasn't just about fulfilling a father's wish. It was about rewriting the way people remembered him. Not as a man silenced by illness, but as a fire that refused to go out. And soon, that fire was about to roar one last time. The day finally came. After weeks of planning, of sleepless nights and whispered conversations, everything was set in motion. The stage was ready, the musicians reunited, and the air around the venue seemed to hum with anticipation. Very few people outside the inner circle even knew this was happening. It wasn't about publicity or headlines. It was about something sacred, a final act of defiance against time itself. Backstage, Robert sat quietly, his body frail but his eyes still fierce. For a moment, Amy questioned whether she had done the right thing. Doctors had warned her repeatedly the strain could be too much, but when she looked at her father, she saw none of that fear. Instead, she saw determination, the same determination that had carried him through decades of battles, both on and off screen. When he was wheeled out before the crowd, the reaction was electric. The audience erupted, not in pity, but in awe. They weren't looking at a man defeated by illness. They were looking at Robert Redford, the same figure who had once defined an era, now returning for one last bow. The cheers rolled like thunder, washing over him as he sat beneath the spotlight. And then he began. His voice was cracked, weathered by age, but the passion in every word carried across the room. Every note, every line was a reminder of who he had been and who he still was. The frailty of his body couldn't erase the fire that lived inside him. For Amy, standing just off stage, it was overwhelming. She watched her father, once untouchable, pour the last of his strength into this moment. It was painful, yes, but it was also beautiful. Because in that instant, he was everything he wanted to be. Not a man fading into the background, but a legend demanding to be seen one final time. The performance didn't last long. It couldn't, but it didn't need to. When it ended, the silence that followed was just as powerful as the applause. Everyone in the room knew they had witnessed something unrepeatable. Not just a farewell, but a declaration. Robert Redford would not be remembered for the flicker. He would be remembered for the fire. The performance was over, but its impact reverberated far beyond that night. For his family, for the friends who stood by him, and for the fans who would later hear the story, it became more than just a final show. It was a reminder of the essence of Robert Redford: resilience, reinvention, and refusal to fade quietly. His career had already secured him a place in history. The films, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, All the President's Men, had defined decades of cinema. His directing had proven he wasn't confined to one role, and the Sundance Institute had transformed the landscape of independent film forever. Generations of filmmakers owed their first break to him, their voices amplified because he dared to create a platform where none existed. But the legacy wasn't just about Hollywood. Robert was also a fierce advocate for the environment, long before it was popular or profitable to be one. He poured his influence into causes that mattered, standing up when silence would have been easier. That combination, artistry, activism, and authenticity, is what set him apart. Still, for Amy and his family, the true legacy wasn't in awards or movements. It was in the man behind the spotlight, the father who made mistakes but loved fiercely, the storyteller who passed down lessons not just through his films but through late-night conversations, quiet advice, and the example of always pushing forward, no matter the odds. That final performance wasn't just his goodbye, it was his gift, a reminder that no illness, no decline, no passage of time could erase the fire of a life lived boldly. It gave his children a story to hold on to, and it gave the world one last glimpse of the man who had shaped culture and challenged convention. Robert Redford's name was already written into the history books, but that night ensured he wouldn't just be remembered as a legend of the past. He would be remembered as a force who burned brightly until the very end. And for Amy, watching her father leave this world on his own terms, that was the most powerful legacy of all. After the performance, Robert returned to his family home in Utah, the same place where he had spent so many of his quietest, most personal moments. The spotlight had dimmed, but for Amy and the rest of his children, the fire of that night lingered. It wasn't just about the applause or the spectacle. It was about knowing that he had gone out the way he wanted, on his own terms. For all his fame, Robert Redford had always been a complex figure. To Hollywood, he was untouchable. To his fans, he was an icon. But to his family, he was simply Dad, a man who could be stubborn, even flawed, but also deeply loving and fiercely protective of the people closest to him. Amy carried the weight of that duality. She had seen her father transform from Hollywood golden boy to industry titan, and finally into a quiet, reflective man battling illness. She had also seen him laugh, cry, argue, and sacrifice in ways the public would never know. His legacy to her wasn't about the awards that sat on the shelf or the endless articles written about his career. It was about the lessons he left behind. Lessons about resilience, about taking risks, and about never letting the world decide who you should be. The rest of the Redford family, Jack, Kelly, and of course Sharon, all had their own memories and private reflections. But Amy was the one who had carried the burden of his final wish. And when it was over, when Robert finally passed, she realized that the gift she had given him wasn't just a performance. It was dignity. It was closure. It was the chance for a man who had spent his life challenging conventions to do the same in his final moments. For the fans who adored him, the story of Robert Redford's final performance became more than just a touching farewell. It became a symbol, a reminder that even the greatest among us are human, fragile, vulnerable, mortal. And yet, even in those final chapters, there is power in choosing how you'll be remembered. Robert didn't choose silence. He chose fire. When the news of Robert Redford's passing spread, tributes poured in from around the world. Fellow actors, directors, activists, almost ordinary fans all shared what he had meant to them. For many, it was his films. For others, his activism. For still others, it was simply the fact that he had dared to create opportunities for new voices when Hollywood refused to listen. But for Amy and the rest of his family, the tributes that mattered most weren't written in headlines. They were found in quiet stories, in the personal memories people shared about how Robert had touched their lives, often in ways he never even knew. That was his real legacy, not just changing Hollywood, but changing people. In the end, Robert Redford left this world the way he lived in it, unapologetically, passionately, and on his own terms. He showed us that legacy isn't just about what you build in public. It's about the fire you carry privately, the impact you leave on the people closest to you, and the courage to keep fighting even when the odds are stacked against you. Amy continues to carry that torch, ensuring her father's story is remembered not just for the roles he played or the films he directed, but for the man he was at his core, a fighter, a visionary, and a father who refused to let illness define his final chapter. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us, because if even Robert Redford, a man who seemed larger than life, worried about how he'd be remembered, then what about the rest of us? What kind of fire will you leave behind when your story is told? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your memories, or the legacy you want to create. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who admired Robert Redford. His impact wasn't just in Hollywood. It was in the lives he touched, the chances he gave, and the fire that still burns in everyone who carries his story forward. Robert Redford is gone, but his fire, that will never fade.